resuming meeting number 126 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, and pursuant to Standing Order 108(2) and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, January 30th, 2024, the committee is meeting to discuss the statutory review of the Proceeds of Crime (money laundering, anti-bracket, and Terrorist Financing Act. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Pursuant to the Standing Order 15.1, members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the members. Although this room is equipped with powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to the microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of the interpreters, I invite participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged in, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. Reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. So, to this study, the Statutory Review of Proceeds of Crime and Terrorist Financing Act, we have with us a number of officials from the Department of Finance. The Associate Assistant Deputy Minister, Julien Brazeau, is with us. Welcome. We have the Director General of Financial Crime and Security Division, Aaron Hunt. And joining Julian and Aaron is the Director of Financial Crimes Policy, Charlene Davison. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming with such short notice. And we do know that you've got some opening remarks prepared for us, so you'll do those, and then we'll get into members' questions. So, Mr. Brazeau.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, good morning, and thank you for the invitation to speak about Canada's anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing regime, hereafter referred to as the regime. In the context of the parliamentary review of the Proceeds of Crime Money Laundering and Terrorist Financial Act, or the PCMLTFA for short, I would like to start my remarks by briefly outlining the state of money laundering and terrorist financing in Canada and explain why it's important to address these serious crimes. I also plan to explain the regime, the role of the PCM, of the Act itself, and the many regime partners working on the financial crime in Canada. I would further situate my remarks in the context of the important recent international and domestic reviews of Canada's regime.
Are serious financial crimes that pose real threats to the safety of Canadians and the integrity of Canada's financial system. Financial crime is not a victimless crime. It affects our society by supporting, rewarding, and perpetuating broader criminal and terrorist activities in Canada. The proceeds of crime being laundered in Canada are generated through predicate crimes such as cyber fraud, automotive theft, human and drug trafficking, including from fentanyl, which has killed many Canadians. Money laundering can also affect affordability by driving up prices in sectors where it is present. For example, the expert panel on money laundering appointed by the Government of British Columbia estimated that money laundering in BC's real estate sector raised housing prices by approximately 5% in 2018. Terrorist financing supports the activities of domestic and international terrorists, including deadly and destructive attacks in Canada and abroad. The complex efforts criminals employ to disguise the proceeds of crime make the scope of money laundering and terrorist financing in Canada difficult to estimate. That being said, in 2021, a report by the Criminal Intelligence Service of Canada estimated that between $45 billion and $113 billion Canadian are laundered in Canada each year. Canada maintains an extensive regime to detect, deter, and disrupt financial crimes. The regime consists of 13 departments and agencies, each with their respective mandates, led by the Department of Finance. The regime is established by federal statutes, including the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act and the Criminal Code. The PCMLTFA is an essential component of Canada's regime. The Act establishes the Financial Transactions and Report Analysis Centre of Canada, or FINTRAC, as it's more commonly known, or le CANAF in French, as Canada's anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing regulator and financial intelligence unit, and defines its operations. It also requires financial institutions and designated non-financial businesses and professions to report certain financial transactions to FINTRAC, have compliance and training programs in place, and identify clients and keep records. Collectively, businesses subject to the PCM-LTFA and its regulations are known as reporting entities. There are over 24,000 reporting entities that play a critical frontline role in efforts to prevent and detect money laundering and terrorist financing in Canada. Reporting entities include banks, credit unions, casinos, real estate professionals, money services businesses, accountants, dealers in precious metals and stones, and the armored car sector as well. Le régime canadien repose sur trois piliers.
Canada's regime operates based on three interdependent pillars. The Department of Finance's role aligns with the first pillar, policy and coordination. The department is responsible for leading the assessment of money laundering and terrorist financing risks and developing and coordinating domestic and international policy. Other regime partners also play an important role in informing and developing policy, including public safety, justice, global affairs, innovation, science, and economic development Canada. FINTRAC's role aligns with the second pillar of the regime, prevention and detection, as it is responsible for promoting, supervising, and enforcing anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing compliance, and collecting, analyzing, and disseminating financial and other intelligence. The third pillar, investigation and disruption, involves identifying, investigating, prosecuting, and sanctioning money laundering and terrorist financing offenses. The federal agencies, including the RCMP, the CPSA, the CRA, the CSIS, and the Public Prosecution Service of Canada are responsible for implementing the third pillar. While the regime as a whole falls under federal jurisdiction, there are many areas of shared jurisdiction with the provinces and territories. Provinces and municipal law enforcement bodies, provincial crown attorneys' offices or prosecution services, civil forfeiture offices, and provincial regulators play important roles in combating money laundering and terrorist financing.
Subject of a number of domestic and international reviews in recent years. These reviews found that Canada's regime generally has a strong legal framework, but achieving operational effectiveness remains a persistent challenge. Other criticism of Canada's regime include challenges in the ability to use financial intelligence, ensure transparency of legal persons and arrangements, successfully investigate and prosecute money laundering, and deprive criminals of the proceeds of crime. The government acknowledges these important reviews and is committed to bring forward measures to strengthen Canada's regime. The rapidly evolving and complex nature of financial crime requires ongoing changes to improve and modernize Canada's regime. In recent years, the government has brought forward measures to provide tools to support law enforcement and investigations and prosecutions, enhance information sharing, and address risks posed by new technologies and sectors. Since 2019, the government has made investments of $319 million, with close to $50 million ongoing, to strengthen data and inform technology resources, financial intelligence, information sharing, and investigative capacity to support money laundering investigations in Canada. Significant funding also went to FINTRAC and the RCMP. Un registre public et consultable.
A public and searchable beneficial ownership registry of federal corporations was launched in January 2024. It will address the use of anonymous Canadian shell companies to conceal the true ownership of property, business, or other valuable assets, with a view to laundering money, avoiding taxes, evading sanctions, or interfering with our democracy. The need for a beneficial ownership registry was a key finding of the FATF's mutual evaluation, the Cullen Commission, and the 2018 parliamentary review of the PCM-LTFA. The federal government will continue calling upon provincial and territorial governments to advance a national approach to beneficial ownership transparency. Budget 2023 also announced a suite of legislative and regulatory measures to strengthen the investigative, enforcement, and information sharing tools of Canada's regime. This includes changes to enhance information sharing powers within Finance's portfolio and allow FINTRAC to better support decisions including national security risks, to allow the Minister of Finance to direct reporting entities to undertake enhanced due diligence to help counter risks, including foreign interference, and require the financial sector to report information on sanctioned assets to FINTRAC.
The government took a broad and comprehensive look at Canada's regime and considered many potential measures for its improvement. This included improving operational effectiveness and enforcement outcomes, facilitating greater information sharing, modernizing legislative and regulatory obligations while balancing burden on the private sector, and responding to national and economic security risks that have evolved in the past 2 decades since the PCM-LTFA was first enacted, including the risks posed by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. The government received 129 written submissions from a wide variety of stakeholders, which indicated strong support for further measures to strengthen Canada's regime to improve operational results. For example, submissions spoke to support for dedicated anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing investigative and prosecutorial resources, and support for the creation of a Canadian Financial Crimes Agency, support for the creation of a corporate beneficial ownership registry, as well as support for greater information sharing, including private-to-private and public-to-private information sharing to detect, deter, and disrupt money laundering and terrorist financing. Many suggestions were also made to strengthen and or modernize criminal justice measures to combat money laundering and terrorist financing, such as proposals to reflect the use of new technologies and address third-party money laundering. Regarding sanctions evasion and threats to the security of Canada, most stakeholders agreed that FINTRAC should be enabled to provide intelligence on these matters, though some were concerned regarding the possible dilution of the PCM-LTFA beyond its core focus on anti-money laundering and terrorism financing. Finally, submissions indicated support for taking a risk-based approach to anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing regulation, including to the expansion of the framework to new entities, and many suggestions were also made to improve regulatory compliance and streamline administrative burden while maintaining the intelligence value of reporting to FINTRAC. En résumé, le gouvernement s'est
In summary, the government is committed to continuing to strengthen Canada's regime. The regime seeks to combat money laundering and terrorist financing while respecting the constitutional division of powers, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the privacy rights of Canadians. The regime relies on multiple partners and all levels of government to work collectively to detect and deter and disrupt financial flows. The government has undertaken investments and other measures in recent years to strengthen the framework and respond to evolving risks.
Measures in recent years to strengthen the framework and respond to evolving risks. The parliamentary review of the PCM-LTFA provides an important means to continue to improve the regime, and the government is ready to support the Standing Committee of Finance in carrying out the review. Myself, as well as my colleagues, Ms. Hunt and Ms. Davidson, would now be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Brazeau and your colleagues for coming before Finance Committee to answering questions from the members, and that's what we're going to get into right now. In this first round of questions, each of the different parties will have up to 6 minutes to ask you questions. We are starting with MP Chambers for the first 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome back to committee for those of you returning for your second time or more. You mentioned to achieve operational effectiveness. In layman's terms, would it be fair to say that includes basically to catch more and convict more money launderers or tax evaders, criminals?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
When you say that the government has done some international comparisons, does the department have any international comparisons on the operational effectiveness of the regimes? For example, in previous appearance, we had some information that showed, in 1 year, 4 convictions under the act were achieved, and in the next year there was, maybe 12. Do we know how that compares, the operational effectiveness compares to our peer jurisdictions?
I think I would say, so we do have, and we released in March 2023, some metrics around sort of the operational effectiveness of the regime. And it did show that in sort of a 10-year time span, sort of the effectiveness of and our ability to prosecute financial crimes has steadily declined and is, we would say, not aligned with the sort of the risk profile of money laundering in Canada. In terms of what's been done internationally, I might turn to Erin, who can speak maybe to that more specifically.
Excellent. No, and that's an excellent question. What I would add is Canada is a member of the Financial Action Task Force, which is an international money laundering standard setter, but also the body that undertakes peer reviews of all of the countries around the world and how they're meeting their money laundering and terrorist financing standards. And Canada is those reviews show that Canada has a strong money laundering framework, but our operational effectiveness is lower and could be improved. And in comparison to other countries, for example, in the G7, Canada is among the lower of our peers in the G7 in terms of how effective our regime is in combating money laundering and terrorist financing. And one of the areas where Canada's regime is a little bit different than some of those countries that have high effectiveness in terms of their enforcement is those countries often have a dedicated police force focused on combating financial crimes in this space.
Thank you very much. So just Cole's Notes version, decent regime, but metrics and outcomes, we don't catch and convict. It's actually quite difficult. When we compare ourselves, we would appreciate direction to the March release if that's possible. A couple other questions because I'm going to run out of time, and feel free to follow up with information. But you said you referenced British Columbia's Cullen Commission saying 5%, potentially 5% of increase in house price appreciation related to money laundering. Has the department looked at a similar analysis for the rest of the country on the impact of money laundering on the housing market specifically?
I don't have that data with me. We can take that back, though.
Sure. So if there is anything on that, I'd be very interested in hearing about it. You talked about private-to-private information sharing. Bill C-27, the Privacy Act, is being reviewed now. The financial services sector, for many years, has asked for the ability to share information with peers in cases of suspected money laundering. Today, they can already do that in fraud. I'm telling you all these things you already know. Did the Department of Finance make any recommendations to the government on expanding that safe harbor provision, if you will, in Bill C-27?
I would say on that question, that's an area of active sort of discussion at the moment. We've had discussions with our ISED colleagues, with the Canadian Bankers Association. We recognize the importance of moving that forward, and so it's under consideration.
Right. Yeah. But there's currently no provision.
No provision at the moment that provides sort of the safe harbor that financial institutions are seeking.
You mentioned reporting entities. One of the big differences between Canada and the U.S., land title companies in the U.S. are reporting an equivalent reporting entity. Land title companies are not going to pay an insurance claim to somebody that they don't know. If we're trying to find out who individuals are, I'd recommend that we consider adding land title companies to a reporting entity list. I'm not on their good books now. I'm off their Christmas card list. But I would strongly recommend we look at that. It appears that you had some summary of the consultation that you released in June. To the extent that information, if there is a summary that the department's provided, say, to the minister or to the government, that would serve our interests very well if we could have the summary of the consultation responses you received. I think that would help direct us in our inquiry. I note the last Parliament spent 14 hearings on this matter. I'd love to spend 25, but we might have something a little less than that. But if you could provide that information, that may help us focus our efforts and where we would go. And maybe finally, 10 seconds left, we'll come back to it. But I'd like to hear from you before we leave here today about where you would recommend we focus some efforts of things that have not yet been probed sufficiently. So I appreciate your appearance here today. And I'd like to reserve the right to recall the witnesses later, Mr. Chair.
Have that right.
Thank you.
Listen, thank you, MP Chambers, and over to MP Weiler now for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today to start our study on the, well, not quite the legislative review. We need a motion for that, but to get a bit of a taster on the work that we're going to do. And I appreciate you laying out the many steps that's been taken in recent years to address some of the shortcomings in Canada's anti-money laundering regime. But one area, actually, Mr. Brazeau, that you touched on in your opening was some news earlier this year is on the beneficial ownership registry for federally incorporated corporations. And this is of course based on Bill C-42, which passed into law last year. And I was hoping you might be able to share with this committee in further detail how getting access to this beneficial ownership information will help the government better go after money laundering by understanding who the real owners of property are, and how this will work with beneficial ownership registries that are in other jurisdictions as well.
Thank you. Happy to answer the question. So the use of Canadian shell companies to conceal sort of the true ownership of businesses is sort of a real problem. FinTrack estimates that 70% of money laundering cases in Canada involve shell corporation. And so the ability to determine who the rightful owners of those corporations are important, not just for money laundering purposes, but as well for tax evasion purposes and other purposes as well. So the government, as you said, introduced a bill, and the federal registry went live just a few weeks ago now. This is a searchable and publicly accessible registry in terms of some information. Some information will be shared directly with some of our enforcement partners. That is information that is not made public. But the goal, again, is to help our enforcement partners be able to determine who the rightful owners are. I mean, one limitation of the federal open banking regime is that federal incorporations account for only about 15% of corporations in Canada. Therefore, the need to collaborate with provinces. Since 2016, there's been a working group established of federal, provincial, and territorial partners to discuss beneficial ownership. And all provinces or territories have put in place some laws that require at least the gathering of information on beneficial ownership. The province of Quebec has been took a head start in terms of the creation of a publicly accessible regime. The province of British Columbia has now committed to doing that as well. At the federal level, we're working closely with our provincial partners to see how we could integrate those provincial regimes to ensure that we've got a full pan-Canadian framework that would be accessible for our enforcement entities.
Thank you. And you mentioned a few of the provinces that have already brought in or have intentions to bring those regimes in. I'm curious at this point what if there are jurisdictions that have yet to make that commitment, or to your point, the need of working together yet to commit to being able to share that information with the federal regime, which of course is critically important to tackle money laundering. As well as it's critically important for Canada to be able to work with other jurisdictions, and the need to have similar format for information so it is easily shareable to go after what is oftentimes transnational crime as well.
I would say, absent Quebec and British Columbia, Ontario has started talking about sort of the potential creation of a registry itself. I mean, we've had productive conversations with our provincial and territorial partners in that regard. I think it's a question of prioritization amongst sort of their respective governments as well. In some cases, some of them do have registries, but they are pay-for-access registries. So how we can sort of align that with the goal of a publicly accessible, free access for Canadians is an area under consideration. But as I said, it's an area of active discussions for us, for the Department of Innovation, Science, Economic Development, who oversees the registry as well. And we're hopeful that sort of in the coming months and years, we'll be able to get some momentum and get additional provinces on board.
Thank you. One of the other changes that was announced in the budget last year is a new requirement for money services businesses to be registered. And I understand there's regulations that are being put together on that matter, and it's something that is oftentimes pointed to by many folks I know in my community about how those are major risks for people laundering money, and many people having information that they're sharing about that. So I was hoping you might be able to speak a little bit more to the importance of having this registration system and how that might help the government tackle money laundering that may be taking place at some of these money services businesses across the country.
I'll start by talking sort of about benefits more broadly of sort of being a reporting entity under FinTrack, and then maybe turn to my colleagues and they can speak a bit more to the specific changes in the legislation and regulation. But the goal of having reporting entities is to ensure that they are subjecting sort of the clients they deal with to enhanced due diligence, and ensure that they are reporting suspicious transactions to FinTrack. FinTrack relies on all of those disclosures to form the basis of its intelligence that it then refers to the RCMP and other provincial police services to then investigate, and then to prosecution service to prosecute. And we continuously, as a regime, evaluate sort of where the risks exist in the regime and look to expand sort of the number of reporting entities based on what level of risk they represent. And so, as you've mentioned, sort of the past couple of years, we've broadened the number of reporting entities on a number of occasions, including armored cars, players in the mortgage sector and real estate sector, cognizant of the ML risk in that space. I'll turn to my colleague Charlene, and she can speak maybe a bit more specifically to the latest changes.
Yeah, Madame Davidson, so it would have to be very quick because we're over time.
Okay, thanks.
We're over time already.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the question. So the obligation for money services businesses to register has been in place for several years now. What we did through Budget 2023 was try to strengthen the requirements of registration. So what kinds of documents for, criminal record checks, or the types of translated or verification of translated documents coming from other countries. So anything that we can do to ensure that we're not registering MSBs that might have business owners that are criminals or involved in organized crime, protects Canada from these types of crimes.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, MP Weiler. And over to MP Samari, please.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today. I also want to salute members who have joined our committee, Ms. Collins and Ms. Chanel, who is going to be leaving us, and Madame Kay, who is here to work with us and does so quite often. Mr. Brazeau, your presentation was very interesting. It is a subject that is of great concern to me, and I learned a lot. Mr. Brazeau, you talked about a beneficial ownership registry, and there were questions asked about that subsequently. In Quebec, there is a great deal of work that has to be done, and in other provinces as well, so that this type of system could be coordinated. But when the bill was passed in Parliament, there was a question that was raised often. In the shell companies and tax havens that are often used by people who are laundering money and entities that are laundering money, what is the work that is currently being done in your department to provide a beneficial ownership registry in tax havens? Well, that's going to have to serve certain entities like the CRA, in that they will help to identify people who are using services in tax havens. I will be honest with you, the issues of tax havens is not an area that I'm very directly involved, and I don't have direct knowledge. But I can certainly take your question under advisement and find information for you. I appreciate that. I'm going to change the topic now. I'm going to turn to fraud, banking fraud in the banking system through identity theft. Am I right in saying that banks currently are not able to put their finger on and report the number of frauds that have been blocked? Well, financial institutions, as well as, and that includes banks, it would have some indication that there were some suspicious activities ongoing, and they would report that to FinTrack. That then could help in mounting an inquiry by the federal services or by the police. And there are also financial institutions that apply under the B20 guidelines, where banks and financial institutions have to verify the information that is offered to them by their consumers. Are they, in fact, who they say they are? And there are frauds in the system. There is fraud. And if that arises, they call upon the police and the penal system to get involved. All right, that's very clear. I would just like to ask something else. To my knowledge, when fraud is committed, when a bad guy manages to get a credit card or open a bank account under false premises, are they blocked if there is some sort of suspicious information? I know that there was an instance where if fraud is not actually committed, but it was just suspicious activity, then nothing had been declared. But you are saying that that is being declared, it's being flagged to FinTrack. I encourage you to pursue in your examination and the revision of the legislation itself to give teeth to it. Maybe I could redirect my question. In the case, there was a transaction that was blocked beforehand. With respect to financial institutions and loans, I thought that the general rule was that the client that was bilked would be repaid for money lost. But that is a reversal of the accountability here, because increasingly I think that financial institutions are putting a heavier burden on the client. Are you in agreement with me? Do you have that same feeling? Well, in terms of money laundering and terrorist activities, what is important is the detection of fraud. It's not really a restitution and recovery. That falls under another area for the consumer. But I can tell you that the FCAC would be better placed to answer the questions that you have asked me. One last question. I know I'm coming to the end of my time. Do you feel that consumers have enough information about attempts to defraud banks and financial institutions? Do you think that the information presently available suffices to help consumers, or should there be stronger measures that would increase the knowledge of consumers about fraud? I think this is something that is worthy of discussion, and it really should be. This is an issue that, as I have just said, probably falls more under consumer affairs than the protection against money laundering and the detection of terrorist activity. but it is an issue that certainly we would be happy to work on identifying. Thank you.
MP Collins, and the floor is yours for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I still remember the 2017 Transparency International study that came out saying Canada had tied with South Korea for the worst transparency regime, and the term snow washing that was used very frequently here in Canada and around the world. It sounds like there's been progress made since then, and I think about the impact of this, especially, Mr. Bresso, you mentioned the statistic of 5%. In my home community of Victoria, the median cost of a single-family home is about $1.1 million. The benchmark value is 1.2. It means that for first-time home buyers, that's $50,000 to $60,000 in increased costs. It's a huge amount that folks are being impacted, and we know that's driving up rent prices as well. And so the NDP has done a lot of work on pushing for a beneficial ownership registry, one that's public and searchable. It sounds like that work is underway. I'm curious, are we following international standards, things like ID verification, a tip line for whistleblowers, a registrar with comprehensive powers, so that we know that people can be issued significant fines?
Thank you for that question. And I think I can say pretty simply, I think yes is the answer to that. If I start with the whistleblowing protections, one of the things that we introduced very recently was new whistleblowing protections under the PCML TFA to ensure that those who are reporting to FinTrack have protections similar to those that already exist under the criminal code. In terms of ID verification, this is a fundamental aspect of the PCML TFA, and so all of our reporting entities have responsibilities to ensure that those that they're dealing business with do that type of due diligence in terms of knowing who their clients are, and that's a fundamental aspect of how our regime works. I'm wondering if Charlene has anything else she'd like to add?
Sure, thank you. You also mentioned about the proper regulatory authorities for beneficial ownership registry. I think that that's really important, and components of that exist in the C-42 bill, and we continue to work with ISED on increasing those powers and authorities.
I'm curious, how effectively it is up and running. I know we're just getting started. Just kind of an update of where we're at, what needs to happen next.
So, thanks for the question. We have just really started. It was just launched sort of a couple of weeks ago, so I think it's early days at this point to sort of determine what the effectiveness is. Certainly, part of the policy decision to have Corporations Canada do this was accompanied by funds to sort of increase its capacity to actually assess this information and enforce it. I think sort of the weeks and months ahead will give us a better sense of how that's working. And again, I think there is still important work ahead as well in terms of working with provinces and territories, because I think the real value of beneficial ownership registries lie in sort of our ability to have as complete information as possible. Therefore, the importance of that continued work.
Thanks so much. I'm looking forward to seeing the work that happens between the BC government and the federal government. It's good to see folks on track. As you know, you mentioned the Cullen Commission, and it released its final report in 2022. Most of the report pertained to BC, but there were a couple of recommendations for the federal government, and I'm just going to quote them: that the Ministry of Finance, either in conjunction with Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation or on its own, develop the required data and conduct a market integrity analysis in order to identify suspicious transactions and activity in real estate, and that the Ministry of Finance develop an action plan for addressing the data gaps and data quality issues identified by the Federal Provincial Working Group on Real Estate in its reports, focusing on data issues with the province's jurisdiction. And of course, the report also recommended the public beneficial ownership registry. But
yeah, so happy to speak to that. And we think that the Cullen Commission was an important milestone for the regime, and recognizing that the focus was on sort of the provincial regime, we certainly took took note of the recommendations as they involve the broader federal regime. In terms of sort of the creation of a real property registry, that issue, I think, is a bit complicated by the fact that lies more within the provincial remit in terms of real estate and property. In the context of the discussions we're having with federal or provincial territorial partners in the context of the broader corporations beneficial ownership registry, that is an area of discussion that we continue to have, however.
So in terms of the action on those two specific recommendations, has there been anything concretely developed in terms of addressing those data gaps?
In terms of the data gaps for the real estate sector in particular, or?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we work sort of consistently with the CMHC in terms of trying to sort of better our understanding of information related to the real estate sector, especially in the current context where the real estate sector is and access to housing is so important. So there are ongoing discussions in that regard. I would say not only specific to sort of the recommendations in Cullen, but to inform sort of broader policy on housing as well.
Yeah, thank you, MP Collins. And now we're actually moving into our second round members and witnesses, and we're starting with MP Morantz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Brazeau, I want to ask you, just on Tuesday, there was a rather explosive report published by Sam Cooper at the Bureau. By the fact that you're nodding your head, I think you're probably aware of this report. The report outlined very serious allegations of mortgage fraud at HSBC, which led to a commensurate campaign of money laundering. Essentially, the allegations were that mortgage applicants would come, apply for mortgages, submit fraudulent income verification letters to get large mortgages, close on homes using proceeds of crime laundered cash. Very, very serious allegations. I'm wondering if you could tell me if before the Minister of Finance approved the merger in December between HSBC and the Royal Bank of Canada, was she aware of these allegations?
So thank you for the question. To be honest, I'll have to take that back. We were certainly aware of the report that came out this week, and I think it is an area for serious concern, but whether it formed the part of sort of the analysis that the minister relied on, we can come back to you on that.
So are you saying you don't know whether she knew, or you can't say at this point?
I'll have to find out sort of from our OSFI, because the information would have been disclosed to OSFI in the context of.
You don't know?
I don't know.
You don't know, okay. Because what's odd about that is that last year in July, FINTRAC published a report raising these very concerns. Perhaps you're aware of the report, but in the report they said that it was about the banking industry and money laundering in 2023. Are you aware of that report that FINTRAC basically talked about the issue of fraudulent mortgage transactions as it relates to money laundering by FINTRAC?
We're aware of the report, absolutely, and of the claims of fraud, and where there's evidence, we certainly encourage.
So that report predated the minister's approval. Having that information from FINTRAC, wouldn't the natural question have been for HSBC whether or not this was going on within HSBC? Was that question not asked before the minister approved the merger?
So I can say in terms of the sort of discussions that FINTRAC might have been having with HSBC, we're not aware of those. I would say in the context of approving the transaction, the minister did impose criteria on RBC in regards to enhanced due diligence and ensuring that they do sort of a full accounting of their AML and ATF practices, with a view towards ensuring that the practices are in accordance with what is expected under the PCML-TFA, and that was a precondition that was agreed to by RBC.
Was there a departmental briefing note prepared for the minister prior to her approving the merger?
There was advice provided to the minister, yes.
Could that briefing note be tabled with the committee?
I'll have to take that back, and we can get back to you on that.
So you'll let us know whether or not it can be
Yep.
it can be tabled?
Yep. It's advice provided to the minister, as in any other transaction that happens in the financial sector.
And do you know if in that briefing note there was any mention of widespread mortgage fraud as it pertains to money laundering?
I can't confirm sort of what was in that.
You can't
that
confirm, or
note.
you don't know.
I can't confirm what was in the briefing note, and I don't have direct knowledge of it, but we can get back to you.
But you may have indirect knowledge of it then.
I don't have I don't have knowledge around sort of the discussion around mortgage fraud in the context of the RBC HSBC.
Okay, I'm not getting definitive answers of no here, which I find quite interesting. Just out of curiosity, assuming that at some point this all comes to light and fines are levied, who would be responsible to pay the fines if the merger and acquisition actually goes through? Would it be the Royal Bank of Canada?
To the extent that the society is dissolved, I mean, I'm not sure. We'd have to take a look at that in terms of what the implications are and who the parties would be that would be found responsible for doing it. If it's fraud and it's individual parties that perpetrated that fraud, then those individuals could still be found liable.
Just one last question. If this turns out to be of concern to the department and the minister, the transaction doesn't close until March. Does the minister have the ability to pause or revoke the approval of the merger?
The approval of the merger is subject to the minister has ultimate approval over the transaction and can choose to revoke or endorse that at any point.
Thank you very much.
Morantz, and now to MP Zerowitz.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all of our panelists today. This has been a very interesting discussion. I'm on my iPhone for some reason. The internet in my office keeps on going out. My first question is around one of the first questions that was asked was about Canada and where it sort of stands compared to other countries. And it was articulated that Canada has a strong framework, but it needs some work on its operational efficiency, and that we don't have a dedicated police force. My question is, in Budget 2022, we created a new Canada Financial Crimes Agency, and that's meant to become Canada's lead enforcement agency. Is that not meant to be the dedicated police force for money laundering, and how's that working?
Thank you for the question. So you're right. Budget 2022 spoke about the potential creation of a financial crimes agency. Work is ongoing. Public safety has had leadership over that file. These are complex conversations in terms of the potential integration of prosecution services into investigation teams, and how we can improve operational results. Those discussions are still ongoing, with advice expected to be provided to the government in terms of what are the potential options, what would be the scope of crimes that would be covered, how that would be funded. So those discussions are ongoing, and at this time, the Financial Crimes Agency has yet to sort of be formally created.
And also, what I'm also been hearing is that money laundering is constantly evolving their methods and networks. And I know that I was looking at past budgets, and that every fiscal document since 2019 has consistently updated the ALM regime, just to make sure that we try to keep up to date, and we're plugging as many holes as possible. Is it fair to say that there's not a magic bullet solution to money laundering, and that governments and regulators will constantly need to be plugging holes in the regime?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. That is certainly a fair statement. I think when you do plug one hole, criminals tend to be sophisticated, and they will find sort of the next weakest point of entry. The nature of transnational crime has changed as well. The use of technologies to perpetrate crimes has evolved, and so it's an ever evolving sector, which is why we continue to assess risks as they evolve, and then broaden the scope and the number of reporting entities as a result.
Thank you. And, I was also noticing that this Finance Committee actually did a fairly extensive study on money laundering in 2018, I believe. And so it's about time we've come back to it. I think it's a very important area. Maybe if you could talk to us about what are some of the key areas of improvement in the ALM regime. So what can our committee focus on as part of our parliamentary review? In what areas can parliamentarians provide you with some constructive recommendations? And I know you've talked quite a bit around provincial and territorial need for them to step up, and maybe there's some federal leadership or some federal enticements that we might want to focus on there. So any advice to any of those questions?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And I think it speaks to the question as well asked by MP Chambers in terms of areas of focus for the committee, and happy to speak to those. As we've talked about, I think successive reviews have pointed to the issues around operational effectiveness, and we would certainly welcome the committee's views and reflections on how we can actually move the dial on the issue of effectiveness in Canada's regime. Mindful that, the trend on prosecutions in Canada is not in line with Canada's risk profile. Would also certainly welcome the committee's views in terms of the evolving risks that are posed by new technologies. We've taken some measures in terms of the use of cryptocurrencies, the use of crowdfunding platforms, et cetera, the use of white label ATMs, but we'll welcome the committee's views in terms of how that landscape is evolving and what risks that represents.
That's helpful. And maybe a quick question. Can you speak to some of, and you've already spoke a little bit to this, but can you speak a little bit more about some of the ongoing enforcement issues with the AML regime?
Sure. Did you want to take that one?
No, that's an excellent question. And I think I would answer it this way. The enforcement landscape involves both investigations, laying charges, prosecutions, and depriving criminals of the proceeds of their crimes. And so it's a spectrum of actions that need to work together. And so when we're looking at effective enforcement and how we can improve that, we're trying to see how we can improve each one of those elements and create a stronger framework to be able to achieve more prosecutions, more charges, and also deprive the criminals of proceeds of crime. And so that looks at both criminal aspects, but also civilian forfeiture regimes and other elements. And so that links both what the federal government can do as well as what our provincial counterparts are able to do, because they are all involved in all four of those aspects of our effective enforcement.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, MP Zarowitz. And now to MP Sainte-Marie, please.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. In your department, do you have any information concerning the money that is withdrawn by fraudsters in terms of money laundering? Do you have any information as to whether or not a part of that money is used for international crime, for international terrorism, or is it more likely to be used for local and national crime and terrorism? Do you have information about that? I can confirm that they are not just domestic crimes, but there is a very international aspect to money laundering. It's very closely tied to transborder crime. And in the information that we receive, because we look at policies, and I think probably, though, the police agencies would be more familiar with the nature of these crimes. But I can say that there is also a transborder dimension. Well, thank you for that confirmation, because when there is a theft of a credit card or a theft, identity theft, that can be found in an international site. That's very disquieting. Madame, you talked about the technology that is ongoing. And so for that to be improved, and my colleague Adam brought this point up earlier about what's being done in the United States, that if the person who is involved is a resident of the country, and if I am to understand, if I could speak exceptionally in English, my impression is that with technology in the technology situation in Canada is more or less a free-for-all. If you compare what we are doing with the United States and perhaps move towards what they are doing, would that be a step in the right direction? Well, we also have the various alerts from the FATF, which is the International Agency for Standards, but it is a very serious issue right now, and it makes the life of our investigators more complicated. But working with FinTrack, we want to be able to increase their capability to deal with this type of matter. Thank you, Mr. St. Marie.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks again to our witnesses. I'm sorry, I'm just going to follow up on my last question because I wasn't really clear on the answer. Just breaking it down, has the Ministry of Finance conducted a market integrity analysis in order to identify suspicious transactions and activity in real estate?
So in terms of a specific sort of market, not at this point.
Is there any plan to do that?
So we are still actively looking at sort of all the Cullen commissions, and the goal is to address all of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
And has there been an action plan developed to address those data gaps that we were talking about identified in the provincial federal working group?
Yes, we do have detailed sort of work plans in regard to information sharing.
Could we get a follow-up to the committee kind of once that market analysis or like once there's been any start on a plan for market integrity analysis?
We can take that back. We've certainly have reflected sort of on all the Cullen Commission's recommendations and have taken a number of measures, and so we'll be happy to sort of report back on what actions the government has taken to address those.
The other thing I wanted to raise was the NDP caucus was recently in Edmonton, and we heard from newcomers there about being targeted for money laundering. And newcomers often face barriers when it comes to accessing credit and capital, and oftentimes are more vulnerable to accepting loans from bad actors. In some cases, newcomers took out loans from what seemed like a safe source, and then that source came to them and they were told, you need to run this money through your business. And were in some ways forced into this kind of money laundering scheme and didn't know how they could access help. Have you heard anything about this kind of thing? If so, what's the department doing to combat it? And what kind of tools are available to explore this?
So as we talked about, I think when MP Wheeler asked the question, I mean, money services business, which encompass some of these businesses, have been reporting entities for some time, but we've strengthened the regime in the past few years in terms of what obligations are imposed on these businesses. We're aware that new Canadians can be taken advantage of, and obviously that's not an outcome that we want. So, as I said, we've taken measures, but to the extent that the committee, would like to reflect on that question a bit more and see how those could be strengthened, to the extent that you identify more gaps, we'd welcome those views as well.
Collins, MP Lawrence, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your time today, and thank you for appearing in person. I just want to, outline some of the facts of the situation, and if you don't have the numbers off your head, that's fine. I would just appreciate an undertaking to provide it to the committee at your earliest convenience. So, how much money was laundered, or do you estimate was laundered through Canada in 2023 or 2022, if you don't have it?
We can take that back. I think I provided a figure of somewhere between sort of 40 to 110 billion.
Yeah,
that
was 2020. I was just wondering if you had a more recent number.
Last year?
Yeah.
Oh, that's the most recent that we have.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And do you have a number for 2015 as well?
2015. We can take that back and see what we.
Perfect. And then how many individuals or companies or entities were convicted of money laundering offenses in 2023?
We can take that back as well. I don't think we've got the statistics. So.
Perfect. If I could get the numbers from 2015 to 2023 on convictions, that would be terrific. And what is Canada's ranking? Of course, there are various international organizations currently with respect to money laundering defense effectiveness in the OECD or the G7.
So in the context of AML, we look at sort of the FATF, which is the body really which does the mutual evaluations of countries and assesses. There's no sort of particular ranking in terms of saying country is number 1 versus number 50, but you're rated on sort of your ability and how effective you are in different measures that are under the regime. As we said, I think in our last evaluation in 2016, the regime was viewed as generally having a strong legal framework, but weaker on operational effectiveness. In an update to that review in 2021, our results were actually increased in some respects, but then decreased in others. The standards for the FATF have become more difficult, I would say, not easier to meet over time. Canada's heading into its next mutual evaluation next year. So it'll be an important time in terms of looking at not just our technical compliance, so what laws we have on the books, but the effectiveness of the regime.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for that, sir. Appreciate that. And just want to follow up on my colleague's question. You said that there is in the HSBC acquisition by RBC a higher level of diligence, including in there that HSBC should be withholding to or upholding current AML regulations. If, as in the Sam Cooper story, there is widespread mortgage fraud, would that, in your opinion, violate the condition?
So, I mean, we look at it, so we're looking at it in the context of money laundering and terrorist financing. Fraud would be sort of a broader sort of criminal issue. The undertaking as it relates to RBC.
They're not upholding their AML obligations if they're allowing large-scale mortgage fraud happening.
So the undertaking
from
relates to
from other nationalities.
Yeah, no, understood. The undertaking relates to RBC, given that they're the parties sort of that are undertaking the transaction, and they are required to apply enhanced due diligence and ensure that they're meeting all the objectives. To the extent that the minister would find that they are not doing that, then it would be to sort of the minister's discretion to determine if she wants to take measures as a result.
Weren't conditions in the agreement for HSBC to uphold the AML standards?
Well, because HSBC is exiting the market, so the obligation is on RBC as the entity who now owns HSBC.
So just to be clear, though, if prior to the merger they were not upholding their HSBC, I should say, if they're not in compliance with regulatory requirements with respect to money laundering, that wouldn't affect. There were no conditions put in place for that.
In terms of their previous compliance with AML ATF?
Yeah, to allow the merger to take place.
Yeah, I couldn't say if that was sort of an area of consideration, but no, the undertakings relate sort of on a going forward basis to RBC to ensure that on a going forward basis it is compliant.
And another change of subject here. Of course, artificial intelligence is very much in the headlines, and of course it could be very beneficial, but there have also been numerous authors who have written about the deleterious impacts. To what extent is your department readying itself for the impact of artificial intelligence on money laundering and criminal activity?
Yeah, so, I mean, artificial intelligence, absolutely. I mean, we recognize it's both an opportunity and a threat. We review our financial sort of sector statutes every 5 to 7 years because there's sunset clauses in our acts. We're in the context of one of those reviews at the moment. We issued a public consultation that closed recently. And one of the topics that we're looking at specifically is a topic of AI and how that sort of both presents opportunities and challenges and what that means for financial services more broadly. So we're in the process of looking at the feedback that we've received and talking to experts around, what is coming down the pipe and what measures are going to have to be taken both from a legislative and regulatory perspective to address those.
Please move quickly on that.
Okay.
Thompson, please.
Thank you, and welcome to committee. I want to just circle back on some of the points that have already been brought forward and just really delve into more specifics, beginning with how you've seen the threats of money laundering and terrorist financing evolve over the last 2 decades. If you could be a little bit more specific in terms of what we've seen in that period of time.
Sure, I'm happy to. I think over the past 2 decades, what we've seen really, would say we've seen that financial crimes are not victimless crimes, and we've talked about sort of the impacts on the real estate market, the impacts of fentanyl has had as well on drug users across Canada. We've seen the use of technology to sort of mask the identity of individuals. And we've seen the use of complex sort of corporate structures, again, to sort of obfuscate the ability to identify who the ultimate sort of perpetrators of crimes are. Canada is an open economy with a stable financial sector, but one that is sort of easily accessible. As a result, it makes Canada sort of a target for money laundering and terrorism financing, and certainly we've seen sort of the complexity of those cases increase over the past 2 decades.
Thank you. And sort of staying with the same theme, are there new groups, new motivations that are driving money laundering, terrorist financing, and specifically around regimes that are linked to right-wing terrorism or extreme white nationalism?
So in November, in I think March 2023, in addition to releasing the regime strategy and some of the performance metrics, we also released the updated National Inherent Risk Assessment. And the National Inherent Risk Assessment, or the NIRA, is the tool through which we work with our intelligence and enforcement partners to identify sort of risks and how those risks are evolving. And certainly, if you look to the NIRA, you will see that the issue of ideologically motivated crimes have been identified as sort of a growing area of concern for the government. And the NIRA really is used as a tool to try to inform sort of how we're going to prioritize our enforcement efforts and where we need to dedicate resources. And so, yes, the issue of white nationalist groups and ideologically motivated crimes is an area of concern that we're mindful of.
And the last thread in that line of questions really is technologies and the proliferation of cryptocurrency. You mentioned AI, if you want to add anything else to that, but comments on how this is impacting the impact of money laundering and terrorist funding.
I mean, the use of cryptocurrencies, and again, I mean, there are benefits and disadvantages to sort of the technologies that underlie these innovations. I think one of the drawbacks from an AML ATF perspective is that the use of cryptocurrency is often sort of, from a privacy perspective, they sort of mask sort of who the users are, and that represents a challenge. And the ability for us to track sort of the money is complicated as well. As I mentioned, we've invested important amounts with FinTrack and with regime partners in terms of increasing their ability to identify those crimes. We've also added cryptocurrencies and the users and distributors of cryptocurrencies as disclosure, and not as disclosures, as reporting entities as well under the regime. And so we are looking at trying to sort of cast a broader net to catch these technologies, but they, as we said, these things evolve quickly, and to the extent that the committee would, we would appreciate the committee's views and sort of recommendations in terms of how we remain sort of at the forefront of those innovations.
Good. So I'd put in another question because following what you've been saying, and thank you, just again trying to pull out any more specifics. The Cullen Commission report, FinTrack, said is not sharing enough information. I know you've referenced that you're taking the recommendations seriously, and you certainly will act on those recommendations. Are you able to say in the short term, because obviously the reporting is so central to the previous comments, what you have started in the short term?
Sure, and I'll speak very briefly to it, and I'll turn to Charlene because I know she has some more specifics. But certainly, we've looked to expand the number of parties to which FinTrack can provide disclosure reports. We've also looked at that in the context of sanctions and the use of potential intelligence to inform sort of sanctions evasion and things of the sort. So we are actively sort of iterating on how that intelligence and those intelligence products can be better used or disseminated within the law enforcement community to inform prosecutions. Charlene, did you want to talk to maybe a couple of specific examples?
Sure. Thank you very much. Budget 2023 In order to increase information sharing from FINTRAC, we established powers for FINTRAC to disseminate strategic analysis related to the financing of threats to the security of Canada. We also expanded the designated information that FINTRAC is allowed to disclose to law enforcement when it has reasonable grounds to believe that the information would be relevant to investigating or prosecuting a money laundering or terrorist financing offense. OSFI, the prudential supervisor for banks in Canada, was designated as a recipient of FINTRAC financial intelligence as it pertains to the threats to the security of Canada. In addition, in the fall economic statement in 2023, in order to combat environmental crimes, FINTRAC, it's under consideration as the bill hasn't passed yet, but it's proposed that FINTRAC be able to share financial intelligence information with Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to combat environmental crime.
Thank you, MP Thompson. And members, witnesses, we're moving into our third round, and I have MP Howland is first.
Thank you, Chair. Before I get started, I just wanted to put a notice on motion, if you could pause my time, please. Committee, as the committee knows, more tax hikes are coming on April the 1st. I think it's really important for us in this committee to make sure that we stop them as soon as we can, especially with the escalator tax, which is supposed to go up on April the 1st. As we know, business costs are skyrocketing with 40-year highs in inflation, and insolvencies and bankruptcies are on the rise. So Conservatives would like to put the following motion on notice. Given that taxes on beer, wine, and liquor will automatically increase on April the 1st, this year's tax increase will be 4.7%, the amount equivalent to average inflation over the past year. Canadians and businesses cannot afford another tax increase. The committee reports to the House that it calls on the government to cancel its April 1st, 2024 tax increase on beer, wine, and liquor. So I'd just like to put that on notice, please. Thank you.
Captured. Yep. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you to the finance officials for being here today. Ms. Hunt, you mentioned earlier about Canada's ranking being on the lower end when it comes to effectiveness. Do you have that number, what ranking we actually are?
So Canada, it's an excellent question. I think Julian also mentioned Canada doesn't get a specific ranking in terms of a numerical value. We're evaluated on two areas under the Financial Action Task Force. We're evaluated on our technical compliance, and there's about 40 recommendations against which Canada is evaluated, and we're given a recommended number or grade, I guess we could say, on each one of those technical compliance areas. And we're also evaluated on our overall effectiveness. And there's 11 areas where we're evaluated on our overall effectiveness. And so Canada's ranking is a combination of those factors, but no one country is given a specific, like there's no numerical order.
Okay, so what are some of the main factors in there that have been decreasing since 2015?
So, and that's an excellent question. Canada has very strong, as we had said, strong legal framework. One of the areas in our 2021 report where we were reevaluated on some of the technical compliance, we were our ranking changed with respect to our coverage of non-profit organizations. Canada, the standards with which Canada was evaluated in 2015 changed as FATF continued to evolve, where they saw risks.
Went down?
Became more stringent, yes. And so Canada's evaluation was lowered in our 2021 evaluation with respect to our obligations on non-profit organizations.
Were the transparency requirements one of those factors as well that went down?
I would just no, but beneficial ownership and transparency was one of the gaps that was listed by the FATF during the 2016 review.
Since 2015, the ranking, has it gone down, up, or stayed the same?
So I would say we haven't been reevaluated formally by the FATF since 2016. They only happen every sort of 5 to 7 years. But there was sort of a reassessment in 2021, and our ranking went up in some regards and down in others.
Overall, the ranking still stayed in the lower end. Did that go down overall?
I would say it remained sort of stable.
Okay. Were there, comparative to Chair, I'll move on. I wanted to know about the investigations. How many investigations have there been since 2015 until now?
We can take that back. I don't have the numbers.
I'd like to get a follow-up on that, as well as how many of those investigations led to actual, what the total number of fines were, and also what was the percentage of people that were set free, that there was no charges whatsoever. If we can get those specific areas covered in what you returned to this committee. Okay. I wanted to know from 2015, were there any specific legislative changes that took place that made our ranking, in your words, go down at all? Or were there any hindrances when it comes to investigating any type of money laundering that takes place?
I would say, I mean, since the last review, the government has been trying to address sort of a number of gaps. There are some longstanding gaps, like the coverage of lawyers, where sort of Canada's regime, the Supreme Court determined that the coverage of lawyers and the issue of solicitor-client privilege stopped lawyers from being covered. But
I just have a little bit of time. Transparency requirements. Transparency International ranks us absolutely at the bottom when it comes to that in the G20, actually. And with the rise in auto thefts and the money laundering that we know is taking place right now, what are some of those barriers, or why is this increasing in Canada with all the rules that we have in place, that it seems like it's getting a lot worse since 2015?
So on the transparency point in particular, I'll just point to the beneficial ownership registry, which has just been launched, which is aimed really at sort of attracting transparency.
Have been effective in some of, if it was implemented before, would it have been effective now in some of the car auto thefts that we're seeing?
To the extent that organized crime groups are hiding behind shell corporations, potentially.
Potentially, but there is no definitive that it would have stopped it. So it may not make any difference at all, right?
It may not. We don't know sort of the nature of sort of the criminal organizations.
Okay, so there's no proof that this change that took place in November, it may not do anything to the car thefts that are happening now.
For car thefts in particular, I'm not sure. I think we'd have to talk to sort of the police services. They have a better understanding of sort of how the criminality there is set up. But the goal of beneficial ownership is to provide more transparency on who the ultimate owners of corporations are.
Thank you.
Now to, I believe it's MP Weiler, yes?
Thank you, Chair. And I think it's also just getting back to your point earlier, it's only 15% of companies are incorporated federally. So it's really important that we do have the provinces step up with similar beneficial ownership registries for corporations. But I want to touch on a number you mentioned earlier. You said there's 24,000 reporting entities to FINTRAC. And from the last annual report, I saw that there's about 35 million transactions that are reported to FINTRAC every year. So, in some ways, it's a tremendous amount of information. And a lot of times it's trying to find maybe a needle in a haystack with a lot of these transactions that are reported. So I was hoping you might be able to explain what the government is doing to make sure that information that is shared with FINTRAC can get to the appropriate authorities in a way that they can, that's decision useful and investigation useful, so that they can be able to determine if it's involved in any suspicious transactions and organized crime.
Happy to talk about the issue broadly, and again, we'll turn to Charlene. I think Charlene listed sort of a number of new disclosure partners for FINTRAC, and the goal there is to allow FINTRAC to use its intelligence products and disseminate them to sort of a broader set of law enforcement agencies and regulators to inform sort of their review. That really is sort of the focus of our work over the past few years. And you're right, I mean, there's a huge volume of information that is gathered by FINTRAC, and FINTRAC tries to consolidate that and look for trends, and then where they do see those trends, refer those to both sort of federal police services and provincial police services. Charlene, did you want to talk a bit more specifically just in terms of how we strengthen the information sharing?
Sure, thank you. The value added that FINTRAC offers is they can take all that information that's coming into them from reporting entities, look for the information that Julian spoke about, trends, comparisons, putting people together, networking, and they can digest that information and sort of pre-package it to go out to law enforcement partners. There are two ways that that's done. With law enforcement, through a voluntary information record or a VIR, can submit information to FINTRAC on potentially an ongoing investigation or case that they may be developing. If FINTRAC finds reasonable grounds that information, paired with information that it already has in this database, can be disclosed to an investigation that's related to money laundering or terrorist financing, they will do so. The other type of disclosures is what's called proactive disclosures. And so this is the potential or the beginnings of a case or financial information that FINTRAC puts together on its own and sends that out proactively to a relevant police department in the hopes that they will begin an investigation. But ultimately, the use of that financial intelligence and the types of investigations that are taken up is a decision for law enforcement.
Thank you. And one of the recent changes that was made or proposed is a new offense for structuring transactions so that they will avoid being reported as obligations under the act we're talking about today. So I was hoping you might be able to explain how that might be aid in being able to tackle the issue that we're talking about today.
Sure, thank you. So as you may know, criminals, one of the methods that they can use to integrate their money or place their money into the financial system is through structuring. So a simple example of this is depositing large sums of money in cash just under the reporting threshold, which is $10,000. So at $9,000, $900. They can do this over multiple days to the same financial institution or to many financial institutions. So Budget 2023 introduced a new criminal offense for purposely structuring financial transactions to avoid having the financial institution do the reporting.
Thank you. And last question, I'd be curious about what type of work is being done to help with education for reporting entities and other organizations so that we can ensure we have the best possible compliance with the objectives of the Act.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's actually one of the main roles that FINTRAC plays. FINTRAC has a dual mandate. It's Canada's financial intelligence unit, but it's also Canada's regulator for the PCML-TFA. And so that means they have the primary oversight to ensure compliance with all reporting entities, the 24,000 businesses that you mentioned. And one of the first things that FINTRAC does is to work with new reporting entities or new sectors that come on board or have new obligations under the Act. And they spend quite a bit of time, 1 to 2 years, working with the sector and educating them on what their obligations are, what a good compliance program would look like within their institution. I think I would welcome you. I'm sure this committee would eventually would speak with FINTRAC, and that's something that they can elaborate on.
Thank you. And MP Samari, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to begin with making an observation following on what Ms. Davidson said with respect to the voluntary disclosure program. To my mind, it represents a type of escape hatch for people who get involved, and when they feel that they're being pushed into a corner and they're going to have to explain what they've done. So the spirit of the law is what what sanction is there? You pay what you should have paid. But in Quebec, we have a program where there is an incentive for major businesses and for clients because if you don't comply, you're not just going to get your knuckles rapped. It will go a little further. And following on what Ms. Hunt said, And in line with what Jazz brought up, why is Canada ranking less favorably than others? It was suggested that one of the reasons was there was no police force that is dedicated to pursuing money laundering or issues of this nature. Could Ms. Hunt or anyone of you explain why we don't have a police force like that, what it would take to set one up if we were to have one, and should each province not have its own specialized police force that would be working within the Federation according to the laws to this end? Thank you very much for your question. I can begin by perhaps clarifying one point. Canada wasn't compared in that way. It wasn't one of the countries that had a very high level of inefficiency. So I just want to make this very clear in terms of Canada. But this is an important question. If that is to say, how can we improve this particular point in Canada? The government has come up with the notion of creating a Canadian Financial Crimes Agency that would work in Canada. And we would like to hear from the committee how it could be created, that it is something that would be important, perhaps, to improve investigations and the procedures in Canada. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. St. Marie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for all the good work you folks are doing. I wanted to ask, I was looking at the money laundering threat assessment and looking at some of the things that were ranked very high threat ratings and high threat ratings. One of the ones that jumped out to me was the pollution crime. Before becoming a member of Parliament, I was involved in the fight to save Shawnigan water. It was there was toxic soil, contaminated soil being dumped close to a watershed, and we know the impacts of this kind of contaminated soil on the environment, on human health. Through that campaign, it was uncovered that the company had a secret profit-sharing deal with the engineers who were doing the safety assessments for it. And luckily, we were able to stop that from happening. It took 4 years, but I'm curious the connection between money laundering and this kind of pollution crime.
I appreciate the question, and it is, as you say, sort of an area of focus and one that was identified in the NERA. And recently, I believe it was in the Fall Economic Statement, we put forward actual measures that would allow FinTrack to start sharing information with the Department of Environment and Climate Change with a view to trying to address some of the risks that are arising and that link between money laundering and environmental crimes.
Thanks so much, and thanks for that work. I was looking at a few of the other ones, Ponzi and investment schemes, as well as telemarketing, mass marketing schemes. This is something that impacts my constituents. Lots of people have lost money through these kinds of schemes. Just curious what work is being done, because that was one of the kind of very high threats.
Thank you. So I think that kind of threat is getting larger in Canada. I think the role of organized crime and transnational organized crime is also increasing, especially in that space. Canada does have the Anti-Fraud Centre, which, of course, people can report cases of fraud to. And fraud is actually one of the higher predicate offenses in Canada, and it produces a lot of proceeds of crime. So that is certainly one of the areas of focus that FinTrack produces strategic intelligence on and discloses information on.
And then I'm curious, do I still have...
The time. So
okay, no, not to worry.
Okay, yeah. So, all right. Thank you, MP Collins, and to MP Morantz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just, I wanted to, Ms. Hunt, just want to follow up with something you mentioned earlier regarding nonprofits. You said that there was a gap in the system as it pertained to the operation of nonprofits. Is the concern that nonprofits could be utilized as a vehicle to raise funding for terrorism?
That's an excellent question. I'll turn my microphone on. That's an excellent question. So the Financial Action Task Force has identified that nonprofit organizations as well as charities do have a risk with respect to terrorism financing in particular. FATF's recommendations focus in particular on having a country sector understand their risks, and so that they make sure that they have a processes in place to be able to understand their risks in this space. And so Canada's evaluation was with respect to ensuring that our sector understands the risks that it may face. It didn't say that it's not a blanket statement, it's just that the sector itself understands the risks.
And on that subject, specifically as it pertains to the IRGC, do you have any information or knowledge that the IRGC may be raising money for terrorism through Canadian nonprofits?
I can't answer that question. I'm sorry.
You can't answer, or you don't know?
I don't know.
You don't know? Oh, okay. What's that?
Could they come back with something?
Could you maybe look into that? If there is anything, come back to the committee with it?
We can certainly undertake that. I think, you know, that would probably be more within our intelligence and enforcement partners, but we can take that back.
Fair enough. Now, I just want to go back to the 2018 report had some fairly specific recommendations with respect to changes to the criminal code. It talked about, one recommendation was to bring forward criminal code and Privacy Act amendments in order to better facilitate money laundering investigations. That was 6 years ago now. Was that done?
There have been some changes to the criminal code. Now, the criminal code sort of rests, I'll be honest, sort of squarely under the Department of Justice's purview. Certainly welcome, I think, you know, your questioning of them. I know they've worked on a number of measures in that regard, but they'll be able to provide you with a more fulsome answer on those reforms.
Well, maybe this falls under your purview. The next part of the recommendation was that any necessary resources be made available to law enforcement and prosecutors to pursue money laundering and terrorism financing activities. Given that you're the Department of Finance, I would presume you would know the answer to that question.
Yeah, there have been a number of resources that have been provided. I think I spoke to about $320 million that have been given to different regime partners to move that forward, including to the RCMP that have created sort of dedicated teams dedicated to money laundering. The creation of we call it FC3 within public safety, which is charged with the coordination of the regime more broadly as well. So, yes, there have been a number of investments in those regards.
I just want to return to Mr. Cooper's report for a second. Under the proceeds of crime legislation, banks are reporting entities are required to report suspicious transactions. The whistleblower in Mr. Cooper's report went to great lengths to let more senior people at HSBC know of his concerns regarding fraudulent mortgage transactions. Do you know if, as a reporting entity, HSBC reported those suspicious transactions?
I don't. That would be a question that FinTrack could answer more specifically.
Would you mind following up with them about that, checking with
their
their colleagues and providing that information back to the committee? I think those are all my questions, actually.
Morantz, and now we'll go to MP Zerowitz.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I'm going to go back to Ms. Hunt and the last question that I left you with, Ms. Hunt, which was a little bit unfair, to be honest. I gave you all of 2 seconds to respond to a very, very huge question, which was, you know, speaking to some of the ongoing enforcement issues of the AML regime. I'm sure you can go through a lot. What would be helpful are, I know that you said, you know, you kind of split them out into different buckets, which I fully understand. If there's something that you want to highlight in each of those areas that you think we need to be aware of, or you think that we need to be focused on, that would be helpful. And I'll give you part 2. What I'm also hearing is there is quite a bit of responsibility and some unique powers at the provincial level as well. And I wonder whether there's some issues there as well when we're trying to look at enforcement issues. So I'm wondering if maybe you could just take a couple of minutes just to address that.
No, that's an excellent question. And yes, I had started before, but it is a complicated question. I think one of the fundamental challenges with financial crimes is that they are extremely complicated issues. They require a dedicated set of experts who have really detailed knowledge in very challenging areas of financial, cryptocurrency, financial markets, and how the transactions work. And that expertise is really important to develop across the country. Canada is one of our strengths as our federation. It also means that there's a lot of players that are involved in this space, both at the federal as well as the provincial and municipal level. And so ensuring that our system is effective in this space is one that is a continual challenge, and one where the committee's work in terms of recommendations and how we can improve effective enforcement is certainly of benefit. One of the areas that we highlighted in Julian's open ring remarks was the use of financial intelligence. This is obviously a really important way to detect and also kind of where to begin investigations. So that area is something where we can continue to look at ways that we may be able to improve that. Charlene has spoken to how we're looking to expand the disclosure recipients as a means to be able to leverage that. Is there more that we can do? On the prosecution side, I think this is an area where in Canada we recognize the importance of the independence of the prosecution services. And one of the things that the RCMP's processes and IMLITs, so they're called, so Integrated Money Laundering Enforcement Teams, often include prosecutorial expertise to be able to ensure that they are able to be effective and efficient. And the other area was taking or restraining the product of proceeds of crime. And this is an area at the federal level is criminal forfeiture, but at the provincial level, there's also an opportunity to explore whether civilian forfeiture is something that we may be able to pursue to look at the effectiveness of Canada's regime.
I appreciate that. That's very helpful. The other question I have, and this again is, I'm asking these questions with an objective of trying to get to how do we do this better? How complementary are the federal and provincial regimes from your perspective? And is there something you could recommend that would actually help that, make that more complementary, more effective?
Thank you for the question. I think based on the Constitution, I think, there is a division of powers. And so the regimes are complementary in some regards, but at the same time, provinces have oversight of some aspects of the regime that the federal government does not have. I think I've spoken to work, certainly sort of at the working level from our perspective with federal and provincial territorial partners. I think, a dedicated forum for those discussions and the ability to have conversations amongst, whether it be ministers of justice or public safety on a more regular basis around how these issues are evolving and how they're considering these issues would certainly be beneficial. But again, I think that's an interesting area for the committee to look at, and we'd certainly welcome the recommendations.
Okay, I think those are all my questions for right now. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you, MP Zarowitz, and over to MP Chambers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You started off by saying how many agencies are involved that touch money laundering, or a portion of it. I'm wondering who goes to bed at night and wakes up every morning and the only thing they think about is money laundering in the federal government? Like who is the owner?
So I'd say finance has overall lead for the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act. That being said, we don't have sort of a line of sight in terms of the criminals and what they're doing. That would certainly be sort of the police services and our intelligence partners. So they live the criminality aspect more of it, but we live the policy side.
And just for my own clarification, you're the Assistant Deputy Minister of financial sector policy. So in addition to money laundering activities, like you have very wide, you're doing open banking, you're doing the widely held rule, you're doing OSFI, right? Okay. Who goes around to the other departments and knocks on the door and says, hey, there's an issue with money laundering? Like, is there a who does that? Would you say finance is the, okay.
It does have the lead, and we have, an internal governance structure, which is probably bureaucratic in nature, but both at the DGs, ADM, DM level, there are regular touch points on specifically on AML.
Perfect. Do you know what a net worth assessment is by CRA? The number of net worth assessments completed by CRA has dropped over 54% since about, certainly within the last 5 or 6 years. They used to do about 1,400 net worth assessments. And now they do, just up until in 2023, up until December, they were only at 400 and something. Have we spoken to our friends at the CRA to say what's happening there?
I can't speak to the issue of net worth assessments specifically, but the CRA is part of the group of entities and agencies in which we discuss sort of the issues around money laundering.
They also receive actionable intelligence from FinTrack, I believe. The number of net worth assessments that have been completed based off of actionable intelligence has also dropped proportionally the same. I suspect the number of actionable intelligence reports sent to the CRA hasn't dropped, but I would be very interested to know how many actionable intelligence reports had been sent to CRA over the same time period. So currently we have the number of net worth assessments that have been completed, which show a significant drop. But I'd be very interested to know if you could help us about, is it that the actionable intelligence has dropped, or are they reshuffling resources within CRA? I have a suspicion about what the answer is, but if we have data to support that, I think that would be very, very helpful.
We can certainly take back the question in terms of
Thank you very much.
Disclosures.
In terms of catching and convicting, in the United States, it's illegal to lie to the police. They have a RICO statute and laws. Wire fraud is like 20 years in jail for wire fraud. In Canada, we don't have the same. Well, you also can be charged with perjury for making a mistaken statutory declaration. As long as the piece of paper says you'll be charged with perjury if you lie on this paper, 15 years in jail. Canada has no similar serious criminal penalties. Do you think that's an area where we should be pushing?
I think that's certainly an area where we'd appreciate sort of the committee's input.
Last question. Did you hear of Bill C-289?
Yes.
Okay.
Private members bill. Yes.
Be very curious to know what the advice was to the government on moving forward with that bill.
We can take that back again.
Sure. I don't need it now.
Yeah. No, I'll just say, that was a bill that was more criminal in nature, so the Department of Justice are the one that provided the advice. Yes. We can take that back, but to the extent that you will be sort of meeting with the Department of Justice, I encourage you to ask them the question as well.
I look forward to meeting with the Department of Justice. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, MP Chambers, and now to MP Thompson.
Thank you. Could you speak to the interplay between sanctions enforcement and anti-money laundering?
We're happy to, and it's an area, I would say, of ongoing reflection for us, especially given the unprecedented scope and scale of the Russian sanctions. We see sanctions and sanctions evasion as an emerging threat for the financial system, and we've seen that a lot of the hallmarks that are common to sanctions are also common to money laundering and financial crimes. As you know, sanctions policy, especially as it relates to the Special Economic Measures Act, lies with global affairs. We've passed in the past budget and fall economic statements a number of amendments that would allow FinTrack to play a bigger role in terms of being able to leverage its intelligence products and sharing that information with global affairs so that they can target and identify sanctions evasion. But it's definitely an area of concern, and that's another area that we would certainly welcome the committee's views as it's looking to undertake its study in terms of the nexus between financial crimes and sanctions evasion.
Thank you. I mean, this is clearly not just a Canadian problem. I mean, it's all Western democracies have to deal with this. I'd be really interested in some international comparators. So if you could speak about some of the unique challenges other countries are facing.
As I said, Canada is just one country in sort of the global regime. Certainly the Financial Action Task Force, as we said, they are first and foremost sort of the authority when it comes to sort of creating standards. I think other countries have similar challenges to us. Beneficial ownership is an issue that's shared sort of among jurisdictions. The prevalence and sort of the development of technology and how that technology is being used to perpetrate crimes is an issue as well. So those issues are not unique to Canada. There are, the federated nature of Canada, as Aaron has said, comes with benefits, but also some complications as it relates to the coordination between the federal and provincial regime for crime enforcement and the like. But many of the risks that are identified in the NERA and that we've spoken about today are common across the globe.
Thank you. I do not have further questions, but I really appreciate you being here today and very quickly accommodating the 2-hour request. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, MP Thompson. MP Sainte-Marie, please.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. A little while ago, there was a report to the effect that it dealt with frauds that exist on social media. In that instance, it was a Facebook where there was a use of AI to implicate people for all kinds of things. A young person in Gatineau got involved in Bitcoin. He saw that this ad for Bitcoin that said, okay, you're going to make a lot of money if you he did a little research, and he decided, given his research, to put all the money that he had accumulated for his retirement into this Bitcoin opportunity, which really was artificial intelligence on Facebook. And after he did so, radio silence, total radio silence, because it came from a foreign country. And so what can be done so that this never happens again to anyone else ever? This is a fraud, yes, but this is also an even broader issue today. Money laundering and terrorist funding. Let me say this. The department is reflecting on the future of currency and how virtual currencies will be used in the future. There are a variety of discussions underway. For example, what type of measures should we put in place to better protect Canadians? The Financial Consumer Agency of Canada is involved, and in the past put out material to try to educate Canadians about instances like that. It's an area that we expect to see further studied. Well, one point here in particular is the financial institution that allowed this for the transfer out of Canada to a foreign country of thousands of dollars. It seems to me that there should be some regulations put in place to prevent this from happening easily. On another issue, Mr. Brazo, earlier you mentioned the Supreme Court decision, its ruling about client lawyer confidentiality. What are the implications of that for the AML? Well, the Supreme Court decision was such that the regulatory framework that governs lawyers it was not legal. But that being said, in the decision, the Supreme Court left the door open to a better alignment with the Constitution. And since that ruling was handed down, the department has been working to establish a collaboration that would adhere to the guidelines. And you have the recommendations that were made by the FATF to better comply with standards, so that there would be measures put in place to address risks in that area. Thank you.
Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And how many minutes do I have? Okay, great. Just wanted to follow up on some of the questions about far-right terrorist financing, and in particular on the terrorist financing threat assessment. Proud Boys, Russian Imperial Movement, Aryan Strike Force, these are all neo-Nazi and neo-fascist organizations that we've really seen become more and more of threats in the recent years. So I'm curious how this has changed the landscape and what kind of financing mechanisms they're using, whether it's corporations, real estate agents and developers. Like what does this new landscape look like?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Absolutely. I think, we've talked about this. The landscape is changing, and certainly sort of the latest National Inherent Risk Assessment identified sort of these extremists and ideological groups as sort of an area of risk. I think our intelligence agencies would probably be better placed than we would in terms of telling you sort of what mechanisms and how these agencies are using these mechanisms. But there is no doubt that some of these groups are engaged in activities that further sort of and foment terrorism. And in identifying them in the NERA, the goal is to prioritize sort of work on these key vulnerabilities in the Canadian context. But again, I would suggest our intelligence partners will probably be better placed to tell you exactly sort of how they're leveraging those schemes.
And then I also wanted to follow up on the question from my colleague about the IRGC. I noticed they weren't listed in the most March 2023 list. And I'm curious, is that because they weren't listed as a terrorist organization at that point? And if we were to update that list, do you have a sense of whether they would appear?
Yeah, thank you. So any of the specific groups named in the 2023 document are those who are listed under the criminal code as a terrorist group at that time.
And so do you look into other groups like the IRGC, groups that might not have, in the 2023 assessment, would you have kind of been recognizing other groups that might not fall on that list and tracking the...
Yeah, so no, the report focuses those that are listed entities only. I think a question of, what's being followed and new trends or emerging threats would be a question for our intelligence partners.
Thanks.
Thank you, MP Collins. And so now our last two questioners we've got for MP Lawrence. Yes? Okay, MP Lawrence.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to follow up on my colleagues' questions. They're excellent questions, I might add. With respect to the IRGC, because this government's refusal to list IRGC as a terrorist group, are you saying that they're not tracked? That there is no reporting responsibility because of their failure, even though numerous times in Parliament we have called upon this government over and over and over again to list them as a terrorist group, but they won't?
So Thanks for the question. I would say our intelligence and law enforcement partners would be more aware of sort of how they are tracked. What we do in the context of the NERA is we sort of work and focus on those that are listed in the criminal code, but I wouldn't want to give you the impression that our intelligence partners or law enforcement are not looking at them.
You would be able to conduct, you'd be obligated to perform additional reporting and monitoring for listed entities as opposed to non-listed entities. Is that not correct?
Yep. And there is a ministerial directive that relates to that.
So if in fact they were listed, as has been asked by Parliament multiple times, it would provide greater monitoring of IRGC.
To answer your question, the terrorist organizations, reporting entities are required to follow the terrorist organizations and ensure that they are looking at those specifically. In addition, in the PCMLTFA, the minister has the ability to issue directives with respect to certain partners that may pose a danger to.
With respect
there's a directive
Could you
with
table that
respect
with
to
the committee?
Iran.
Could you table that with the committee?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. But they are not a terrorist organization, so they're currently designated as such, they're not currently listed as a terrorist organization, and so that could limit or reduce the amount of monitoring, therefore allowing for greater funding of Iran and their terrorist activities.
The Iran directive is not specific to any one entity. It is with respect to transactions with Iran. Reporting entities are required to place an additional due diligence.
We're listed, there would be greater monitoring.
There would be additional monitoring with respect to their role as a terrorist
and
entity.
Presumably,
like
if the IRGC was subject to greater monitoring, we would be able to, if there was money laundering going on, to stop more of it. So we are allowing more money to go out every day to the IRGC, a terrorist organization, because this government's willful disobedience to the will of Parliament.
Every organization under the PCMLTFA has obligations to identify what it would see as suspicious transaction reporting, and that remains regardless. And they have to do additional due diligence with respect to Iran due to the ministerial directive that is in force.
But listed organizations have a higher standard than non-listed organizations.
Listed organizations, those types of financial transactions would be prohibited.
So it's a higher standard. Thank you for that. How much time do I have left, Peter? Perfect. So just to conclude, once again, we would, and we know that you're doing the best you can. If my frustration came out towards you, I apologize. It's extremely frustrating to me that the Parliament has voted multiple times to give you the additional tools that you need to prevent the IRGC laundering money through our account to fund their terrorist activities, and so. We need to give you guys the ability to do that. So just one last time, just for clear, if in fact the IRGC was listed as a terrorist organization, your ability to stop their money and laundering activities would be enhanced. Just a yes or no.
Under our sanctions laws, Canadians are prohibited from dealing with sanctioned entities.
I'll leave the last.
Chair, for the last minute, I just wanted to confirm with the witnesses and through you, Chair, that there have been substantial requests made for some documentations and for numbers and investigation numbers and all those kind of things. I just wanted to make sure that in following routine proceedings that within 3 weeks, as it is outlined, that we are able to get those answers from the officials, if I can get you to confirm that.
Well, I know the officials will make their best efforts to get the information that has been requested and that they said that they could provide.
Yeah, for any undertakings that have been confirmed, I just wanted to make sure that we get that.
Of what has been requested of the officials, yeah. Okay, and now we're going to go to MP Weiler, please.
Thanks, Chair. Earlier in your testimony, you brought up the the significant investments that have been made into law enforcement of recent years to be able to better collect and share data related to organized crime and money laundering. I think you mentioned about 319 million, but also in your testimony you mentioned some of the challenges with operational effectiveness. And of course, this is a very challenging topic when you're dealing with organized crime that's operating over multiple jurisdictions, using shell companies, in many cases obscuring the real ownership of different assets, and being able to exploit wherever there may be a gap. So it speaks to the ongoing challenge of updating the regime. And speaking to the operational challenges, one of the things that's been proposed a couple of years ago is the creation of a Canada Financial Crimes Agency. I know this is a public safety lead, but they've been leading a consultation for over a year now on this. But I'd be curious from your point of view, what role do you see finance playing in such an agency? And what type of input have you provided to the consultation as this body is being contemplated?
Great. Thank you for the question. So we've been working closely with public safety and the rest of the regime partners. This has been sort of a topic that's been discussed both in the context of the governance committees that I've discussed sort of at the DG, ADM, and DM level, and we've had a number of discussions with enforcement partners as well to sort of identify what are the challenges, what are the scope that we would envisage for a financial crimes agency. And I would say that work is ongoing. As I said, I think there are, some constitutional sort of limits in terms of what can be done. There's questions around reform for policing to be addressed. So these are important and broad questions, and so they are all being discussed in the context of this initiative. And we're hopeful that within the short to medium term we'll be able to land on a recommendation that will be presented to Cabinet on that.
Okay, be very much looking forward to seeing what that is, and I think it's oftentimes a big challenge for the prosecution service and for law enforcement to have that dedicated expertise, forensic accountants and otherwise, to be able to go after the nature of this type of crime. So I'll be looking forward to seeing that as well. And we've talked quite a bit today about the importance of working with provinces and territories, and we've seen a number of provinces take some pretty significant steps on civil forfeiture. And my province of British Columbia just last year passed legislation to allow for unexplained wealth orders, which is really important when you're trying to tackle a very complex level of crime where you can, in a way, reverse the onus. And so the suspect will have to prove how that asset was achieved. I'm curious about your thoughts about the federal government looking at introducing a similar type measure within its area of jurisdiction, and how that might be able to help with tackling money laundering in Canada.
Thank you for the question, and certainly we're conscious and have looked at sort of the BC experience on unexplained wealth orders. It's been an area of discussion as well between the federal government and BC. I would say it's an area where we welcome sort of the committee's views as well in terms of what is the federal role, mindful that provinces sort of play a closer role when it comes to unexplained wealth orders, but how within federal jurisdiction we could help advance that case. In the consultation paper, we consulted sort of specifically on that and received some feedback in that regard, but we welcome the committee's views on it.
Okay, so we have requests to look at unexplained wealth orders, to look at artificial intelligence and cryptocurrencies, to look at potential offenses as well. Is there any other areas you would like this committee to explore in the forthcoming parliamentary review of the Proceeds of Crime and Terrorist Financing Act?
Sure. I think we also talked about sort of the intersection between financial crimes and sanctions. I think that's an area of growing concern. And I think another area would be sort of how do we potentially sort of streamline some of sort of the obligations that are imposed on Canadian businesses. The regulation in this sector is really important, but at the same time, we realize that it places a heavy burden on our financial institutions to ensure that they comply. We'd welcome your views in terms of how we potentially create efficiencies there, while without damaging the regime or damaging the intelligence that we gather. But how do we sort of make it easier for Canadian businesses to comply with their obligations?
And maybe if I could just add to Julian's answer. The consultation document took a really broad look at the regime, and we would welcome the committee's views on the areas that were advanced in the consultation document. We deliberately looked at a variety of different topics that could warrant further review.
Thank you, MP Weiler and MP Zamari.
Thank you, Chair. On a point of order, Thursday next, we should be moving to pass the report on budgetary consultations, but we don't know what party is going to be submitting a dissenting report. So if there is a party that is going to do so, can you set the date for any type of dissenting reports?
So next Thursday we will be doing the PBC report, and I don't want to presume that we'll get through. I would love to say that we're going to get through it on that Thursday, but if that so happens, then after that we have a break week before we come back, and then I would want to table right away, I would think, right in the House, so that would be the next Monday. So probably the Friday after the Thursday would be, so next Friday. I'm just right. Dependent if we get through the PBC, right? Yeah.
I like a deadline, Chair.
Okay. Well, that's listen. I wish I could foretell the future, but I can't. But what we can do right now is thank our great Department of Finance officials for being with us and for giving us so much testimony for this study. We really appreciate your time, and again for coming on such short notice. Thank you. And on that, we're adjourned, members.